I'm going to read this book, a little more of this book here. It's Tom Robbins' book, Jitterbug, Perfume. I'm on like the first chapter here. Let's see. Part 1, The Hare and the Bean. But I'm like a few pages into there. So this is like part 3 or something of the first chapter. Anyways, here we go. Reading some more. We left off where Alabar had just faked his own death. And so now he's alive, and this is continued on. This is where we're going. Where we're going. We're going somewhere. Here we go. East was good enough for the morning star. It would be good enough for Alabar. He should not travel westward, for the Romans, with whom his people had traditionally skirmished, controlled the westlands, and for a long time now the Romans had been increasingly under the spell of some borrowed god who sounded like particularly bad news. Modern Romans insisted that there was... Wait, let me get this microphone a little bit closer here. Let's see. Here we go. Modern Romans insisted that there was only one god, a notion that struck Alabar as comically simplistic. Only one god, a notion that struck Alabar as comically simplistic. Wow, did I just read? I read that twice. Worse, the Semitic deity was reputed to be jealous. Who was there to be jealous of if there was no other gods? Vindictive and altogether foul-tempered. If you didn't serve the nasty fellow, the Romans would burn your house down, and if you did serve him, you were called a Christian and got to burn other people's houses down. There was a long list of enjoyable things Christians could not do, however, including keeping more than one wife. Come to think of it, mused Alabar, that might not be such a bad idea. Ah, but Christians were meddlers, and a man on the run from death, duty, and who knew what else. Man, this hair's getting in my face. Get hair in my face. Sorry about that. Ah, but Christians were meddlers, and a man on the run from death, duty, and who knew what else, was a man who didn't need meddling with. It was possible that he had insulted quite a few deities of his own acquaintance, so he couldn't relish some aggressive, foreign hothead getting in the act. Christians populated the south as well as the west. While up north the pebbles lay with their faces already in snow, the Alabar and neither furs nor spear, their faces already in snow, and Alabar had neither furs nor spear. Okay, I'm getting it all wrong. I might have to start this one over. Who cares? It was settled. He would journey into the east, whose pincers had so recently released October's buoyant moon. When the last spasm of nausea had subsided, when all traces of dirt and drug had washed away and his blood flowered melodiously and clear, he stood, stretched, gathered his burial wraps about him, and set off a trot towards the east and the multiplying unknown. As he trotted, he could hear in the distance the drunken din of the city, where his people simultaneously lamented the broken mirror and celebrated their rescue from feebleness and decay. Then he turned upwinded, and night was suddenly quiet. He paused and looked back. The red glow of torches and bonfires caused the city to resemble a miniature sun setting. Let it set, he thought. A fresh one will rise in the east. Nevertheless, there were pangs in his heart. Mixed in that cauldron of sound that had just faded might have been the feline wails of Wren, who, no doubt, lay with the new ruler beneath his eminent covers. Or ermine covers. Did Meek snore at the foot of the bed? He wondered. That was his dog. He misses his dog. All of Alabar's wives belonged to his successor, if he wanted them, but Meek was eternally Alabar's and would have been buried with him had he not demanded prior to his execution that the hound be spared. I would vow to retrieve you, Meek, whispered the former king, but as sorely as I miss you, I will not be back. Not one companion from my reign will I ever see again. He was quickly to be proven wrong. Oh, he was proven wrong. Interesting. I'm going to take this microphone and I'm going to pin it to me because it picks up way easier like that. And then I can push this out. And then you can see some art. There you go. He was now at the threshold of the dark forest. Unarmed, he dare not venture deep inside, lest enterprising beasts process his flesh into sausage cakes and brew their winter's ale from his blood. Therefore, his plan was to lie down just inside the tree line and sleep under daybreak. At earliest light, he would strike out, attempting to transverse the woods before it again grew black. Having a terrible thirst, however, a need to rinse his mouth of the accumulated residue of mead, mud, and egg surprise, he decided to first go in as far as the spring and drink. Then he would retire to a resting place less convenient to the wolf kitchens. The spring bubbled in a little glade. A clearing lit by an altar, the ever ceremonious moon. So bright was the glade that Alabar could watch his chateau slide along the promenade of moss and kneel with him to drink. Me and my shadow, he said wistfully, anticipating a popular song by 1,000 ears. Me and my... what was that? His shadow had attracted a second, a companion shadow, slightly smaller than itself, nonetheless human in shape. If his shadow was no longer alone, what did that mean? He too enjoyed companionship. And if his shadow friend aimed a shadow spear, could Alabar conclude that a spear was pointed at him as well? Still on his knees, Alabar whirled and lunged at the place where the shadow had led him to expect he would find legs. Yes, those were legs he grabbed. He yanked them hard, hoping to upset the body and supported before it could shove a blade through one rack of his rib cage and out the other. He felt the spear point graze first his cheek and then his shoulder, as the being who welded it crashed down on top of him. Alabar no longer knew how the shadows were behaving, but as for himself, there was an attacker straddling his head. Disgust mingled with fear as he labored to withdraw his face from the advisory's crotch. In the struggle, some part of him, most likely his nose, fired a message to its brain. The message contained a single word: female. Alabar pulled himself free, from which force he had fell backwards onto the spring, where he surfaced, spewing and sputtering dead leaves and the addresses of dozens of hibernating frogs strewn about his beard. He found himself contemplating a spear tip again. This time, however, he could see the face of his assailant, and while he was no longer surprised that it was a woman, he was astonished that the woman was Froll. Alabar's amazement was mild compared to Froll's when she realized that he had tried to puncture her recently executed lord and husband. Her young mind reeled at the potential redundancy, and she fainted straight away. Alabar revived her with water he wrung from his clothing, and they spent a largely incoherent hour sorting things out. Following her destruction of the prized mirror, only the invention of the new king had prevented the clan from ripping Froll to shreds. It seemed the king desired to honor Alabar's precedents, desired to govern rather than merely rule. Interesting. Alabar detected the influence of Ren, so he urged compassion, as he believed Alabar would have done, and reduced Froll's sentence to banishment. Moreover, Froll was driven from the city in a blizzard of curses. His Highness handed her his own spear, with which she might least delay the dinner of the bears. Alabar could picture Ren whispering instructions in the freshly royal ear. 5 minutes or less was required by Froll to explain her presence in the forest. The remainder of the hour was taken up by the Alabar's protest that he was not a spectre. Slow to be convinced, Froll accepted Alabar's concreteness. Only after he produced the tenemus of his urinary network to arc a stream in front of her. "Everyone knows that ghosts can't piss," he exclaimed, and although she was acquainted with that particular wisdom, it sounded too logical to be denied. He's like, "I'm not a ghost. Look, I'm gonna pee." She's like, "Oh, ghosts don't pee." Among those travelers who make their way without maps or guides, there breaks a wave of exhilaration with each unexpected change of plans. This exhilaration is not a whore who can be bought with money, nor nor a neighborhood beauty who may be wooed, not wooded, wooed. This exhilaration is not a whore who can be bought with money, nor a neighborhood beauty who may be wooed. She, to persist in personifying the sensations of, as female, is a wild and sea-eyed Yrden, the darling daughter of adventure, the sister of risk, and it is for her that rare and always ephemeral embrace, the temporary pleasure she exerts from the membrane of ecstasy, that many men leave home. Alabar was presently in her arms, having made a sudden shift in direction due to Froll's heavy load. She was timed to give birth on the next full moon, and was now bearing west, however, all seeking a nearby haven where Froll might deliver, rather than the distant edge where he might test fate. On the surface, it seemed a less adventurous choice, yet the prospect of raising a family in Christendom was far more challenging to Alabar than any potential combat with man or monster, and the very spontaneity of the decision inflated his humor. Thus, even though his back now was turned to the lure of the morning star, even though a stout breeze flattened his beard against his Adam's apple, even though his damp clothing clung to him like frost, he whistled from stump to rock as if he were a tea kettle leading the pack in an annual pot and pan cross-country marathon. 3 days later, still whistling, pulling a stumblefoot Froll along, he entered the village of Elfric. Abruptly the whistling stopped. Elfric was a huddle of hooves, an ugly little settlement of thatch and mud in which dwelt the peasants who farmed the manor of Lord Elfric, whose imposing manor house loomed over the village. Although it stood a quarter-mile away, Alabar's blue eyes scrutinized the rude peasant houses and the peasants themselves, bent and beat from a crowded calendar of toil. He examined the granite turrets of the manor house, surveyed the surrounding fields and woods. His toes curled nervously in his boots. But just when they were about to uncoil and propel him towards a scenic bypass of downtown Elfric, his gaze settled on Froll's belly. He claimed his toes. He took Froll's hand. "Here we shall build our muddy nest," he said. The peasants received them warmly. Naturally, they were suspicious, but newly baptized. They were sensitive to the responsibilities of Christian charity. Recognizing in Alabar the mien of a warrior, they suggested that his proper employment would be as a vassal in the military services of Lord Elfric. Despite his reputation, Alabar had little fear of recognition. Elfric was merely 40 miles west of his former castle, but there was not a single serf who had traveled more than 10 miles from his or her birthplace. Once his beard was shaved, his hands calloused, his body stooped by the processing of the harvest. Not even the most cosmopolitan of the Lord's knights would be able to identify him. Moreover, he was dead. Long live death, whistled Alabar as he windowed grain from chaff. To Froll, Elfric presented a more difficult challenge. Pregnancy afforded a peasant woman no relief from work. not even if in its own final hours. Softened by the sables and scented pillows of the harem, Frau fainted 2 days in a row while pounding flax with the heavy scrutchers. Thereafter, she was dispatched each dawn to the manor house, where she waited upon ladies. Ever spunked, Frau served without complaint, and the ladies soon learned not to trust her with breakables. One night in bed, Alabar removed Frau's hands from his waist and lifted them appropriately above the rough blankets, examining her stubby fingers. He said, "Here's where glassware comes to die." They fell asleep smiling. It is to erase the fixed smiles of sleeping couples that Satan trained roosters to crow at 5 in the morning. Among the observations made by Alabar during his first few weeks here as a citizen in Elfric, all were these. Here the people bury their dead, not in common communal mounds, but in individual graves. Now that I have come to regard death as a private challenge rather than a social phenomenon to be exploited once it has occurred, for some common reason, as my clan regards it, I wonder if Christianity may not have something in its favor after all. The priest of the manor reminds me to no end of Nog. He is absorbed with his position on the estate of manipulates everyone, lord, lady, and serf alike, to better his situation, to tighten the church's grip on the society. These resides, however, in a human stick beyond the fringe of the village, another kind of priest, a wise old man called the shaman. The shaman lives outside the social system, refusing to have any part of it, yet he seems to connect the populace to the heavens and the earth far more direct than the priest. Perhaps that is why the priest despises him. The main vegetable consumed in Elfric is the turnip. With my clan, it was the beet. Could that explain why these people are so docile and mine so fierce? More than once during his first year in Elfric did an ex-king Alabar reconsider applying for a vassalic position with the lord of the manor. The life of the peasants was brutally hard. In return for the lord's protection, they had to work a prescribed numbers of days a week on his lands. In the few remaining hours they plowed, seeded, and harvested their own meager holdings, and performed an endless succession of chores, such as chopping wood, butchering game, shearing sheep, digging ditches, drawing water, mending roads, carting manure, and building carts in which to cart still more. In the quiet ache of evening, Alabar listened to his calluses grow, a sound that emerged in his ear with the echo of the switch on the ox's hide. By then, Gray had overtaken one of 4 hairs on his head, and some nights he would pluck those pale hairs as if they were petals, saying to Frol, "If I wasn't elderly when our clan decreed I was, I soon will be." Harsh labors pierces the rosy membrane of youth and lets the shivering brine seep in. Nevertheless, the work-worn months held satisfaction. The novelty of one's wife continued to fascinate Alabar. Frol remained as devoted as when he was her sovereign, and she showed signs of maturing into a woman of sexually adept as Alma, and only slightly less intelligent than Ren. With her company, he was content, and when she issued twins, one of each gender, that first November, a new dimension was added to his life. Back in his home city, his offspring had raised communally in a nursery adjoining the Heron. The nursery was a female province, as foreign as his bootsteps as the serpent-seared cliffs of the edge. Now he discovered children. The discovery blew blasts of sugar into every chamber of his heart. When Alabar had enough energy, he catalogued his experiences and observations and tried to profit from them. To what end he could not say, because Christianity emphasized the values of the individual. In the Roman scheme, every person had his or her place, in the frame of mind in which he'd been since he was violated by the hare. This concept appealed to him, proving food for mental mastication. Providing food for mental mastication. The peasants were a dull lot, by and large, but they had exhibited extraordinary kindness in helping the strangers set up housekeeping in a flea-bitten cottage with a dirt floor. Their friendliness increased after the first Froll out of conviction, and then Alabar, as a strategic maneuver, agreed to be baptized in the name of their exclusive god. However, certain activities were conducted in the village from which Alabar and his family were barred. These activities seemed to be social in nature, generally merry, and coincided with the seasonal observances. The traditional winter festival, which among Alabar's folks as well as many other Europeans was celebrated during the 12 days that separated the end of the lunar year, 353 days long, from the end of the long solar year, 365 days, and whose purpose it was to equalize the two different celestial years, had been appropriated by the Christians and transformed into a religious holiday called Christmas. As far as Alabar could determine, Christmas was the same winter festival as Yore, except that the profound emotionalism annually dissipated by the moon and sun influences, the priest here attributed to the natal anniversary of Christ, a Semitic man-god whose exact relationship to the one god Alabar could never quite get straight. On their first Christmas day in Elfric, Froll and Alabar were obligated to spend the entire morning in church, listening to sermons and hymns in a language they could barely understand. Later in the day, they trampled through the snow to the manor house, where the lord served up a mammoth meal for all of his serfs. At dusk, Froll and Alabar returned to their cottage to sleep off the food and drink. But long after their candles had been extinguished, lights flickered in the homes of others, as well as in the community lodge, from which laughter and song poured most of the night. The songs that Alabar overheard were most unlike hymns, and the whoops and guffaws that mixed in the clear, frosty air were most unlike prayers, although for his part Alabar deemed them every bit as godly. The rivalry continued nightly until the 6th day of January, the determination of the 12th day, lost or supplementary month. The revelry continued nightly until the 6th day of January, the termination of the 12th day, lost or supplementary month. Since there were similar goings-on at the time of the old spring fertility festival, the priest called it Easter. And during the feast of the dead in late October, All Saints' Day, according to the Christians, since he and Froll, as newcomers, were never invited, and since the priest steered clear of the merrymakings, while the shaman in the horny mask occasionally dropped by, Alabar was to conclude that for all the pious Christians convictions and peasants still clung to the pagan customs that were their archaic heritage. His conclusions was correct, although a night was fast a-coming when he would wish he was mistaken. Let's see how much more I should read. Let's read to the next page. We'll just zoom through this. His lips curled over the rim of the cider mug. Alabar sat before his hearth. Outdoors, the snow was piled halfway to the Big Dipper, and the earth lay as passive as the eyeless potato. More snow was falling, and Alabar praised each and every flake. Onward, snow! The subdued landscape awaits your crystal victory. Although the peasant women bruised themselves at the cookpot, the spinning wheel, and the loom, weather had curtailed their husbands' labors. And for the respite, Alabar thanked the new god, the old gods, and the morning star. and the snow itself, for the snow seemed energized and awake in a universe that slumbered like a cadaver. A cadaver. In most of the crackling fire, Alabar dandled his babies on his knee. Maybe they meant to type dangled. And at last gave them full attention to his lot. He gave full attention to his lot. Nice. How he welcomed this opportunity for an uninterrupted thought, externally and internally. His life had changed dramatically since that silver hair had flagged him down. And though the next day was Christmas, it was not upon the pigs roasting in Lord Elfric's oven, nor the epiphanies marinating in the prayer book of the priest that he dwelled, but upon his path from kingship to peasantry, and upon what future twists that road might take, a life in progression. A thing to behold, so lost in reverence that was he that when there came a loud banging at the door, he let both his mug and his infants drop to the hearth. The mug rolled onto the flames, but the twins, having slightly less rounded contours, stayed where they fell. Yes. Frol unattached the door, and out of the dark trooped a snow-dusted band of the neighbors' faces scarlet from the cold and strong drink. The villagers embraced them both, not a little lavishly, and placed wreaths of holly and cedar about their necks. They bade Alabar and Frol accompany them to the community lodge. Ooh, they got invited. Frol was unnerved by the boisterousness of the peasants, normally so sober and staid, but Alabar whispered, Let us join them. More than a year has passed. This is our second Christmas in Elfric, and finally we've been judged trustworthy to participate in their seasonal fun. By the tone of it, we are about to be included in ceremonies more ancient, more unrestrained, and I suspect more heartfelt than any we have had shared on the morrow. The entrance to the hall was decorated to resemble the face of a breast. Eyes bulging and burning, lanterns inside goatskins, teeth of thin wooden slats. They entered through the mouth of the creature, walking over blood-drenched hides that represented the great animal tongue, and constituted perhaps the original red carpet. Inside, the lower rafter beams were luxuriously festooned with coniferous burrows. Oh my gosh. These tongue twisters. Holly and running cedar. Although damp logs smoldering in the fireplace had smoked up the place to that extent that detail of the greeneries were barely discernible. It didn't matter, for there could be no mistaking the kegs of cider that rose majestically in the smoke. Frol and Alabar let their cups be filled repeatedly, though in fact most of the liquid was speedily sloshed out by the jostling of fellow citizens as they coaxed the newcomers to join with them in bawdy songs. Frol strained to learn each lyrical indecency. But Alabar simply sang over and over again the only song he knew or had ever known, an epic about battles that were fought long, long ago, back before the morning star impregnated the she-bear who gave birth to beats. String and wind instruments were being played expertly. Soon dancing commenced, assisted by chemistry of the cider. Alabar and Frol relaxed and sipped into the noisy spirit of things. Frol danced with every clodhopper who asked, while Alabar munched sausages and black pudding and played at dice and cards. Shortly before midnight, as if by signal, the singing, dancing, and games suddenly stopped. Thinking the party's over, Alabar and Frol made to gather their wraps and sleeping babies and go home. But they were told that if they left, they would miss the highlight of the season. At that moment, two peasant women decked out in their finest embroidery, emerged from the greenery that was piled behind the cedar kegs. They were carrying a board upon which was balanced a many-layered cake. A table had been moved into the center of the lodge, and upon the cake was set. The way the men moved in to surround the cake, you would have thought a naked maiden was about to jump out of it, but that particular advancement in the baker's art was 9 or 10 centuries away. One of the women took a knife from her fancy apron and began to slice the confection. When it was divided to her satisfaction, the other wife served. 1 piece at a time was passed out, to the men only. When all the males, including Alabar, had been served, they began to eat their slices, chewing very slowly, watching carefully all the while the motions of their companions, the slow muscular rise and fall of jaws. Except for the soft chewing, the hall had grown as silent as the gills of a fossil. The cake was so moist and sweet that Alabar would have been inclined to compliment the chefs. Would not the finest tribute have resounded in the still of the lodge like a falling tree? When he bit into something small and hard, something that sent a shock of pure hot pain vibrating along the length of a neutral wire, he dared not to cry out, because if a compliment must be suppressed, then doubtfully so a compliment. Not wishing to hurt the feelings of the bakers, Alabar removed the object from his mouth as inconspicuously as possible, a gesture doomed to failure, for every smoke-reddened eye in the room was upon him. Upon examination, the object proved to be easily identifiable, and for all the temporary distress it caused his molar, rather objectionable, since everyone was looking anyway. Alabar, somewhat colored by embarrassment, held it aloft for them to see. "Just a bean," he said shyly. Before the word was fully spoken, a huge roar went up in the lodge. "The bean! The bean! The bean!" "The bean!" they cried, men and women together, and the villagers advanced on him, slapping his back, musing his hair, hugging him, and squeezing his private parts. A wooden chair, a rickety imitation of a throne, was fetched and placed beneath a rack of antlers recently nailed to the wall. Alabar was led to the throne and made to sit upon it, whereupon, amidst the deafening cacophony of whoops and hollers, belly laughs and sniggers, purposefully belches, and equally intentional farts, a lopsided crown of mistletoe was laid atop of his head. When the crowd began addressing him as King, Alabar gasped. His heart swung off its pendulum, and his blue eyes stiffened like the pawns of December in a bowel-loosening, need-locking, cider-evaporating attack of deja vu. "Viva Frabram Rex!" he seemed to hear them shout, as if long through curtains of snow and cake. "Viva Frabram Rex! Long live the king of the bean!" He's just been anointed a new king or something. What's going on? According to custom, the king of the bean had absolute license. For 12 days following his chance selection, he reigned supreme, ordering his fellows about indulging his passions. He was allowed to wallow in every pleasure, however sinful. Nor door nor bed was barred to him. At any hour he might enter another's house to eat and drink his fill. If he wanted a neighbor's wife, she was his. Likewise any daughter. Obscene behavior, such as urinating on the altar of the church, not only was permitted, it was encouraged. Wherever he went, whatever he did, the Bean King was attended by a rowdy entourage, adjusting his mock crown so that it always sat askew, pulling at his mock robes so that they revealed his buttocks, plying him with song and cider, cheering him, jeering him, egging him on. When this was explained to Alabar, he thought, well, if they desire a king, how fitting it be me. This kingship comes to me by sheer fortune, but I dare say none other is more experienced than in the role. True, I had planned to give up the wintry days of contemplation, but it is festival time, and I could use some fun. Frol has satisfied me plenty, but I confess that there be 3 or 4 skirts hereabout I would not mind lifting. They wish a monarch, do they? Little do they realize that their being in this vegetable wisdom has selected the one man suited for the job. Hee-haw. Then the peasants explained to him that the rest of the custom, at the end of his 12-day rule, on the day of the Epiphany, the usual restraints of law and morality were abruptly restored. Still wearing his cooked crown, the king of the bean was led to a certain meadow outside the village where his throat was cut. Who's there? Alabar from the village. I must speak with you. Let me in. Go away. No, I cannot go away. I'm the king of the bean. Inside the hut there was a laugh, for the ancient animal ancestor of laughs. A cackle would wound like prickly yarn around the wild spindle in the throat of the fox. You have strayed from your kingdom, your majesty. I am not subject to your authority. In fact, go frig yourself. Alabar leaned against the shaman's door. Never had he been so near to weeping. If only he had his beard back so that he might sop up the tears. You don't understand. I'm not playing games. I am not one of the peasants. I am a king. So you inform me, king of the bean. Go swill another cup of cider, you highness. And don't forget to ask the priest for forgiveness when you kneel in the church on the morrow. Alabar bashed the door down with one furious lunge. He careened inside, sending broken sticks flying, and lifted the shaman from his mattress. Without a painted deer skull over his head, the old man did not seem so formidable. Alabar shook him until his various necklaces of various teeth chattered like a flock of enamel jays. All right, said the shaman. All right. What are you seeking, information or wisdom? Wisdom? In that case, you're out of luck. Wisdom takes a long time, and you're going to be dead in 12 days. Alabar threw the shaman onto his tick. No, I am not, he screamed, stampering to his feet. No, I am not. The shaman grinned like a weasel running errands for the moon. I am twice king and twice condemned, and I'm sick and tired of it. First a hare and then a bean. If death wants me, let him ride upon a pale mount, ashes in his mouth, ice in his testicles. Let him swing a scythe and make horrible noises. Let him come for me in person, not send some hare, some fucking little black bean baked into a gaudy mutton butt peasant wives. Even then, I might not go frankly. I do not like the way death does business. A glimmer of interest showed in the shaman's eyes. He raised himself on his knobby hips. He glanced at the snow that was stiffening over the contents of his hut. Do you feel a bit of a draft? Here, help me hang this skin over your door. Then I'll brew us some mushroom tea and we'll discuss your problems. While his host hunkered over the diminutive adobe hearth, Alabar sniffed at the various braids of dried vegetable matter that hung against the walls, each broadcasting a different version of intentional conditions within the plant kingdom, and he fingered the bones, fangs, and snail shells that, like chimes to be rung by the shaman's heavy breathing, dangled from the ceiling. Each fragment of flora and fauna had been removed from its original context to juxtapose incongruously, yet each seemed perfectly in place. The party in Alabar's head, which agitation and anxiety were throwing, now was crashed by a notion existence can be rearranged. Torn between showing his thoughts to the door or seating in on a place of honor, Alabar was received in the dilemma by a steaming cup shoved into his grasp. Here we go. The shaman sipped ritualistically. Alabar told his whole story, when only the dregs were left of the one's tea and the other's tail. The shaman took several short pieces of string from his pocket and began to knot them together, mumbling all the while. In my net, he mumbled, I bind the sobs of the dark ice crackling. In my net, I bind the axe response to the pine cone. I bind the larva curved belly. I bind the hole in the sky where the comets escape. I bind the roots of the rainbow and the flights of the alder. He went on and on in that manner. My net binds the hornet's deaf's grandmother, until Alabar was ready to grab him and give him another shaking. Just as Alabar reached to the end of his patience, the shaman unclasped his hands, revealing the piece of string, which in the nodding had turned into a delicate violet, its petals the color of bits on a collarbone. Love bites on a collarbone. Alabar reached for the flower, but it burst into flames and was consumed of the shaman's fingers without burning them. It was Alabar's turn to mumble. In the future I shall be more careful about whose door I knock down, he said, mopping up with the sleeve the tea had spilled into his astonishment. The shaman laughed. Don't pay attention to that old magic, he said. It used to be powerful, but now it's the pastime of a few crazy old farts who remember how to talk with weeds. Alabar sought to protest, but the shamans interrupted. Man is turning away from the plants and animals, he said. Slowly it's breaking his bonds with them. I think I'm going to end it right there. And the shaman starts to explain all that stuff. We'll leave it right there in the shaman's hut. All right, we'll be back for another part. Read some more of this book. Thanks for joining me. Thanks for being here. I'll be back soon.